Alrighty. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you're viewing this. My name's Joe Uncle, and today I chose option one, and we're gonna talk a little bit about Ralph Fletcher's Boy Writers Reclaiming Their Voices. I do want to preface, I apologize for not making this presentation full screen. Something's up tech-wise. I don't know. It's not letting me record in full screen mode, so this is the best we're gonna get for the moment. And I figure the best way to dive into this book and just talk about it is going through some questions that were posted and then put in some sprinkles of other tidbits that I pulled from it. Overall, before I even jump into this, I really enjoyed this book a whole lot. I found well, I guess that actually transitions into slide number 2 here. I saw a whole lot of myself in this. As a boy writer myself, who hated writing, absolutely hated it. I would probably even go as far as being honest, saying I was afraid to do it because it just seemed so foreign to me as a younger student. The author, Ralph Fletcher, talks about so much of this resistance coming from boys. And he's just like, well, why does this resistance really occur? And I chose this book, and it really relates to me because I was that boy writer who hated this, who was afraid of it. And I realized from reading this book that perhaps a lot of it was not so much necessarily me as a learner, as a student, but rather the systems around me and the larger educational experience. But I'll get on into that a little bit more. More importantly, why did I choose this book? And I chose it for the practicability and being able to apply it to my own students. As a male educator, and who has had this experience of being a struggling boy writer, I wanted to read this to see if there's any strategies to encourage other boy writers to find their voice within it, to make writing something more enjoyable. How I found my voice, I'm going to be honest, I don't really know. I enjoy to write this day. I write for pleasure myself, and this book talks about so much about having boy writers find their voice through whatever means. So let's just go through this book a little bit. Just a brief overview. I'm not going to cover everything in this overview. I'm mostly covering the stuff that stuck out to me or was the most salient points. And I broke this down into 3 sections, and of course there's subdivisions. The first one is, how do we appeal to our boy writers? And the big glaring thing is, honestly, give these students choice. Now right there, we have to be careful with the word choice, because we talk about all the time in the GSE giving our students options and choices on what assignments and tasks they do. But what the author in this book really brings to light is, well, how much choice are you actually giving them? And it makes you question, you might be giving options, but is that the same as giving them a choice? Do students have a choice to go to school? Do they have a choice to be enrolled in your class? Chances are the answer is no, they don't have a choice. So this author really makes it known that giving students a choice in what and how they write is how you're going to empower, encourage them. Often, especially in the era of standardized tests and having to meet standards and all these other benchmarks, whatever, you might say, here's prompt 1, 2, and 3, but that's nothing that our students, or in this case, our boys, want to write or talk about. Now, choice in this book really is broadened down into other aspects here. And again, there's more stuff, yeah, I'll use a technical term, stuff, that was talked about, but the ones that were really important when it came to choice was violence. And violence in this situation is not meant to be something that goes against school guidelines or walks the line of inappropriateness. The author makes a claim in this book about how often there's always a nature and nurture debate. And the author makes the claim that typically our society says, well, people become violent because of nurture. However, the author gives their reasoning why nature might also be a factor in this that we might not want to consider. He talks about his own son and how even though they were very anti-gun, anti-violence, his youngest son was making sandwich guns, basically. which me reading that, I'm just like, huh, that's kind of funny. But at the same time, that goes back to it. Their environment, their nurture does not support it. Why is this boy making this? So when you give choice, and if students choose to write about something violent, let them. Obviously, there is a line, and what that line will be depends on the teacher, the district, the policies, etc. But the author also makes this idea of like, don't over dramatize it. I forget the exact term they use. It was like ramp up. I think it was ramp up. Like, don't say grotesque violence. There's a difference between students write about violence and students are portraying grotesque violence. It makes it seem so much worse than it could actually be. Moving on to the next point, just so we get through the rest of this presentation here. Emotions. From this book, it seems that a lot of our boy writers do not want to express their self-emotion. And a lot of that has to go back to saving face, especially in middle school and high school. Boys don't want to be viewed as weak. And writing, in its current structure, or its typical structure, I should say, makes boys, or forces boys, to express all these emotions that might make them seem vulnerable. And especially in front of other boys, they don't want to be deemed as weak or lesser than anything else. Other aspects of choice. Humor. Boys will find humor in most things. With that being said, just because boys put in some humor or comedy aspects of it does not mean they're not taking the writing task seriously, whatever. You know what I'm trying to say here. It shows that they care enough that they're putting their own life and soul into this through humor. And last, drawing, but I'm actually going to save most of that for a later slide. Other aspects of appealing to our boy writers is creating an environment that attaches pleasure to writing. Often boys attach physical pain to writing. And there's a whole section on here in this book about handwriting, and especially the pain that all boys feel when it comes to using fine motor skills and how it's physically taxing them. But there's also the mental component of it as well. Often boys are told they have to write it because they're in school and that's what they have to do. They're doing it because they're forced to. Our teaching environment needs to be like, hey, yeah, you might have to do it for whatever requirement, but at least you can have fun with it and put your own life into it. Another huge aspect of this book, and it's present throughout basically the entire book, is challenging traditional values of writing. What does it mean to be a good writer? And how this traditional, typical mindset limits our boy writers from wanting to write. Different writing norms exist. All different people have different personality traits or identifying features, whatever term you want to use here. And teachers need to learn to balance the individual with the expectations that come along with standards and whatnot. So especially when it comes to our boy writers, they're going to use a whole lot of different words and sentence structures to convey certain meaning, all depending on the purpose that they are writing for. And what we might see as such a tiny, minute detail, unimportant, they might view as a huge important step. In this book, there was this student sample, and he was talking about how he went hunting with a father. And even though I had this book in front of me and I prepared the presentation, I always forget if it was New Hampshire or Vermont or Maine where they're at. It was one of those 3 northern-ish states. New Hampshire, okay. And the boy goes on a hunting trip with the dad. And as he's writing this experience, which is kind of like a rite of passage up in their community, he talks to the teacher. It's just like, okay, well, when dad cut open the deer, it kind of smelled like death. What does death smell like? And for the teacher, they might have just brushed it off as like, okay, we'll just say it's smelly or gross. But for the boy, this became a huge aspect. It actually hung them up so long that they could not continue the writing task until they could somehow in words convey what death smelled like. So, with the words in the varying sentence structure, we have to realize that they all serve a meaning. And just because they don't fall in line with the traditional values of writing, with a nice fluency, proper vocabulary, sentence structure, grammar, etc., does not mean we should dismiss it. And last, I feel like this is the whole purpose of this book is to find ways to empower and encourage our boy writers. The author actively wants our teachers, no matter what you are, how you identify, to be a mentor for these boys, to support them to become strong writers. The next question we have up here: what is helpful from a teaching perspective? From this, I feel, and I'm going to repeat this for the next slide too, the most valuable aspect of this book is finding the beauty in boy writing, no matter what form it takes. Boys are crude. Boys are very blunt. Boys sometimes might even use bad language. We might see all these outliers and be like, oh my goodness, this is so out of control and this is so bad. But really, if you look at the content and what the boy is trying to portray, you're going to find beauty in it. And you're going to see, hey, he's expressing himself. He is in touch with maybe his emotions, again, depending on whatever the topic is. And there is a passion and there's a drive behind this. By pointing out flaws and a deficit perspective mindset, it's going to bring the boy down. Also, from a teaching perspective, what this book really brings to the surface is all these semantics and this surface level things about writing, whether it's bad handwriting, poor grammar, spelling, being violent, lacking a sense of seriousness, whatever it might be. Often teachers write this off without even wanting to consider what the boy is trying to say. Some of the best writing, or let me rephrase that, some of the best content might come from a boy with the worst handwriting, or the worst spelling, or grammar, whatever. But if you don't take the time to look at it for what it's worth, you might lose that and disempower our boy writers. And the third bullet here, and I feel like we'll just focus more on the quote for this: a conflict of interest, a conflict of interest between boys and teachers of writing, or there is a conflict. Yeah, there we go. There is a conflict of interest between boys and teachers of writing because teachers often feel the boys are not applying themselves or taking their work seriously when they write in this fashion. And this fashion is, again, typical or non-typical writing structures and fashions and meanings, whatever. As educators, if we want to encourage our boy writers or even any writers, we have to step outside of what we think is a good model and focus more on, one, the individual needs of the students, their passions, their drives, because that's what makes it individualized and personalized education. But also, we might be limiting them and taking power away from them by forcing them into a preset mindset of what a good writer is. The boys, that's how they develop their resistance to writing. They don't want to fit into that mold. They are different. And by forcing them into this mold, it doesn't encourage them to be who they are. So as a teacher, we need to balance these two extremes of allowing the boys to express what they want and how they want, and also standards and whatever other guidelines we need to have in place. Moving right along, as a social studies teacher, I feel a lot of this advice, wisdom, can be applicable to my content area. So as I already said in the previous slide, was the largest thing I took away is just let boys write and express themselves, or express what they want and how they want. I got a quote up there if you want to read it, but I'm just going to keep pushing forward here. In a social studies classroom, I feel there's a lot of, I guess it's a more conducive, maybe is the right word, environment for our boy writers. And I'm thinking back to the original slide 3 here, which has all these bullet points here. If boys don't want to express emotion in a social studies classroom, they don't necessarily need to. In a sense, in a social studies classroom, they can express just facts and concepts. They don't have to put their own emotions behind it. So if boys are expressing this more surface level stuff, and even though it is nonfiction, and this book explains that boys truly really like the whole fiction and fantasy aspect of it, at least boys don't need to worry about being portrayed as weak within a social studies classroom. And this quote right here, I feel, is very powerful to show um, how much fear, I guess, is in boys' minds when it comes to looking weak. Boys measure everything they do or say by a single yardstick. Does it make me look weak? And then I added on further at this: when weakness does become present, what educators need to do is make sure to save those boys' faces, if you will, and allow that defeat and that weakness to be done in privacy. So they don't feel weak and they don't have to worry about the stress that comes with potential ridicule from peers. Other aspects of the social studies classroom that is great with this book is violence. As much as some people might try to deny it, history is not sunshine and flowers. There's a whole lot of good, don't get me wrong, but there's also a whole lot of bad and a whole lot of downright ugly. And with that whole downright ugly, that means there's a whole lot of violence attached to understanding history. Boy writers who have this, again, nature, nurture, whatever side you want to take on it, this attraction to violence for one reason or another, they can find an outlet in writing activities in a social studies classroom because our histories have a lot of violence in it as it is. And last, social studies is all about expressing historical arguments and using evidence to support it. If the goal of supporting and empowering our learners is just to get them to write, in a social studies classroom, boys can truly write whatever they want, provided they can, or write whatever they want to create a historical argument, providing they have the evidence and facts and reasons to get behind it. Any historical argument can be made if you just dig hard enough and you give sound base for your arguments and your conclusions. So, giving the freedom of that comes with a social studies classroom, if you can find your reasoning, you can argue it, and that can be your writing task. That is choice in its finest. Moving right along here. From the course readings, the main thing that I wanted to break this down is how it connects, but focus honestly more on the disconnects. So on our surface level, the connections from both our Tompkins textbook and Fletcher, again, boy writers reclaiming their voices, is both authors advocate integrating choices into tasks, assessment, instruction, whatever, differentiation, in the pursuit of self-interest to make literacy tasks, again, whether that's writing, reading, whatever, more meaningful and enjoyable for our learners. This is their education, and educators need to cater to the needs of the students, make them feel good so they can actually obtain the material and skills from our instruction. That's probably the big overarching connection we can make with our text. However, one thing that really came to the surface, especially from chapter 3 of Fletcher, is he notes that education in general is revolved around this model student, and he makes the argument that that model student is a girl. It's that student that's sitting calmly at the table, hands folded, doing the work. He says that's your girl student. Boys aren't that way. They're more rambunctious, out of their seat, causing trouble, what have you. And he says because there's this difference between boys and girls, this model student does not work well for boys. And as teachers are constantly comparing them to this model student, and there's no way that a boy could actually fit into this model, it discourages them, disempowers them, and further alienates them from their education. Now, for this reason alone, this is my interpretation, I would say, Tompkins kind of pushes these norms. Tompkins might be pushing this girl reference point of view and just say, well, this is what good reading, good writing is. Tompkins, again, through the lens of Fletcher, focuses on this traditional form of literacy and developing those skills. Fletcher actively seeks to challenge these, to empower our boy writers, and to stop the comparisons between two different groups of students that have two different needs when it comes to education. Now, with this whole book, there are still some questions I have in mind. And a lot of my questions don't necessarily revolve around certain parts of the book, but they revolve more about the applicability to modern day within our classroom. So this book was written in 2006, and he focuses a whole lot on New Hampshire. And I just did a quick Google search of it. So my first question here is, the book takes place in New Hampshire, which is currently, so as of 2020 actually was the census data, 90% white. It was actually like 89.6, but 90% white. Does the advice and guidance in this book, Boy Writers Reclaiming Their Voices, apply to our boy writers of various backgrounds? Just like boys and girls have different needs when it comes to education, depending on race, ethnicity, even other factors, sexual orientation, gender identity will impact the effectiveness, or at least I would maybe assume that it would have a different impact on different groups of people. So does this apply to those different groups of people? The next question is, since this book was made in 2006, how has this text, or at least our understanding potential of it, changed or evolved over these years as our gender norms have also changed? A whole lot has changed since 2006. So, it's something that we need to consider. Moving right along, other key standouts from this book, and I feel probably my favorite one, well actually no, my favorite one's the second bullet, but they're both good examples. The use of visuals and drawings to support writing. Often educators really only think of writing as processing thoughts into words to put on paper. However, this author, Ralph Fletcher, says, well, let's consider other aspects of expression, including drawings. And he basically notes, like, often, actually, I feel, which quote is it, the first one or the second one? The second one, I feel, is probably more applicable to where my train of thought's currently going. But what about the drawings boys might do at the end of the process and the end of the writing process, so publishing? But as part of composing it itself. So basically, this is actually only like half of a quote, because the first half I didn't find too relevant, but the whole context of this was, so often teachers would give a task, it's like, okay, write something. Good, now make a visual aspect of it. What Ralph Fletcher is advocating here is like, well, what if boys are writing, but then they also doodle something? When you make any form of art, drawn expression, it conveys information processing within the brain. So if educators incorporate visuals and these drawings, not just as a post-publishing aspect, but as part of the composing process itself, boys could probably get more from and express more through the inclusion of these visuals. Now, the second bullet, which I already alluded to, was my favorite one, talks about how one positive experience with writing for a boy can basically turn their entire outlook around. Now, this might seem super overgeneralistic, but at least for me, it gave a nice warm and fuzzy feeling that sometimes it only takes one teacher, one positive experience for boys to find their voice and to find purpose in writing. And they gave this example of poetry. And in this book, I believe it was either a famous poet, or it might have just been a basketball player that made poetry. Regardless, the topic was basketball. And this student was very just not involved with writing, especially writing poetry. And the teacher showed this poem about basketball. And this student felt so connected to it that they said, I can do this, and I can do it with soccer, an interest of their own. And they wrote this awesome poem about soccer, following a similar structure to the basketball one. And because of that one single experience, that boy became a poet themselves. They started competing in competitions. And it turned their view about writing, especially poetry, around. And from the survey that Fletcher conducted, it seems like a lot of boys that identified themselves as a writer at heart had that one experience that totally turned themselves around. Now, with that being said, just some closing remarks about this book. And I feel like you already know what I'm going to say here. When it comes to our boy writers, educators need to empower them um, to do any writing tasks. Let them express themselves how they want and on whatever topic they want. Of course, there's going to be some sort of boundaries within the class for external reasons or another, uh, but just giving them the opportunity to express who they are as an individual can go miles when it comes to their ability to write, their willingness to write, and their desire to write. And the other huge final remark of this is educators need to stop looking at boy writing from a deficit perspective. Every student comes in with their strengths, and we should be looking for ways to maximize their strengths rather than emphasize their weaknesses. By only pointing out the weaknesses, that's how you alienate people from the writing process. So if educators can identify these strengths rather than their deficits, pointing out what's good rather than the shortcomings, um, our boy writers might be more willing to continue to be involved in writing. By constantly pointing out the deficits and the shortcomings, that's going to make them feel invalidated. If you feel invalidated, why put yourself out there if you're just going to be crushed again? Boys, and I can relate to it myself as a struggling boy writer, by pointing out those flaws, I'm not going to want to take those academic risks anymore. I'm not going to want to put myself out there for the fear of failure. I'd rather make it look like I didn't try and I didn't care rather than try my hardest just to be told it wasn't good enough. And with that, everyone, thanks for sticking around for this almost half an hour video. I enjoyed this course a whole lot. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. And I look forward to reading everyone else's presentations on their professional development books. If there's any questions about my video, I'd be happy to answer them within the comments below. Take care, enjoy yourselves.